Immigrants come to America looking for the land of opportunity. Many thrive, but there's one barrier we hear time and again: harmful stereotypes.
People assume that all Latinos are undocumented.
Tonight, the impact of those stereotypes on the American dream.
Specifically, there was this sense of fear, anxiety, concern, and a lot of uncertainty about what was going on.
And the fight for racial justice through the eyes of Black immigrants in Washington.
I did not learn racism until I came to the United States. I had no idea.
When you hear the word immigrant, what comes to mind? Undocumented, uneducated, someone who can't speak English? Tonight, we're looking at stereotypes versus the reality. Thanks for joining us for Facing Race. I'm Joyce Taylor. So who are the 44.8 million immigrants here in the United States? Let's look at Washington. 1 in 7 people living in our state are immigrants. 77% are here legally. That means nearly a quarter of the immigrants in our state are here illegally, but nearly half are naturalized U.S. citizens, and 38% are college educated. Out of all of the immigrants who call Washington home, 23% are from Mexico. That's just one of nearly 36 countries that make up what we call Latin America. So are people with family roots in Latin America Latinos? Are they Hispanic? And more recently, you may have heard or read about the term Latinx, which has gained popularity recently in academic and some progressive circles. My colleague Jessica Jenner Castro is originally from Brazil. She walks us through the term Latinx.
Latinx is a relatively new term used to describe a person from Latin American origin or descent. The X is supposed to be gender neutral. Latino references a male, Latina a female, so with the X on the end, it covers everyone. According to Google Trends, the term first appeared online in 2004 in Puerto Rican academic papers to, quote, challenge the gender binaries encoded in the Spanish language. But a study by the Pew Research Center shows only 23% of U.S. adults who identify as Hispanic or Latino have ever heard of the term, and only 3% say they use it to describe themselves. The confusion stems from trying to lump people from so many different countries and cultures together. It's often incorrectly assumed that all Latinx people speak Spanish. In fact, in the largest Latin American country, Brazil, they speak Portuguese. And in some Caribbean countries like Haiti, they speak French. Another misconception is that all Latinx people are brown in skin color. Some countries like Chile are predominantly white. Latinx is just the latest in the struggle to appropriately identify this group of people.
In the 1970s, the term Hispanic showed up, but that implies a connection to Spain. And as we explained, not all countries in Latin America speak Spanish. Later in the 1990s, a new label emerged, Latino. And now we have Latinx, the X for inclusivity.
So then, Jessica, what terms should people use?
Well, Joyce, I'm Brazilian, and based on my experience and other Latinx people I've spoken to, they don't necessarily like Latinx or even Latino and Latina. They'd like to be identified based on country. So Brazilian, Colombian, Peruvian, Panamanian, you name it.
Which makes sense. So Latinx is just really too broad for so many different countries and cultures.
That's right. And even the Spanish that they speak in Latin America varies from country to country with slang and accents. And a lot of the U.S. stereotypes, especially here on the West Coast, are based on Mexico. And on that note, I spoke to 2 Mexican women about the racism they've experienced.
So when I started living here, the first thing that I noticed is that I was afraid to drive.
Getting behind the wheel, learning new signs, roads, and driving customs was just one hurdle Jacqueline Garcia of Des Moines had to overcome immigrating to a new country. After getting married 10 years ago, she moved from Mexico to the United States.
When I arrived to the U.S. in 2010 to live, I just felt like I lost my identity for completely. I didn't know who I was. So it was pretty difficult for me to process all of that.
And that was just the beginning of fitting in the U.S. As you can tell, Jacqueline has a strong accent, and that brings with it a lot of unfair assumptions.
And I'm not worried about my accent, but I noticed that that is something that even that people can think that, oh, this person is not educated because her accent, or oh, she's from Mexico, so maybe she didn't finish the high school, something like that. That happened to me.
But what if Jacqueline had a French accent, or one from the UK or Italy? Those might be considered exotic, even refined. But Latin American immigrants face a different reality, a unique form of racism. If you're brown-skinned and you have an accent from a Spanish-speaking country, you might be illegal, even a criminal.
We don't do that with Canadians. When people think, oh, undocumented immigrants are coming to work, people here in Washington State don't even think about Canadians. I've known many Canadians that are here with no documents. Nobody questioned them.
Maru Mora Villalpando is also from Mexico.
I think this was probably the first time I came to Seattle.
She's a community activist known for her advocacy for immigrants.
We were not afraid of ICE. We're ready to fight back.
Especially those held in ICE detention centers.
So precisely the criminalization of immigrants was created under the assumption that we're all Mexicans, we're all here undocumented, and because we speak Spanish, we are giving ourselves away and we need to be detained and deported.
A 2012 study conducted by the National Hispanic Media Coalition showed media portrayals of Latinos can exacerbate negative stereotypes. The same study also found a majority of respondents associated Latinos with roles like criminal, maid, or gardener based on television shows and movies.
People assume that all Latinos are undocumented, all Latinx families are undocumented, and the other thing is they assume that we didn't have access to education.
And that assumption would be way off for Jacqueline Garcia.
I'm a surgeon dentist. I graduated from the university in 2007.
That's right, Jacqueline is an oral surgeon who owned her own practice in Mexico. A perfect example of how you can't assume someone's educational or legal status based on the way they speak. Take these two women. Can you guess which one is here without papers?
When I came out as undocumented, people were shocked. Light skin, I speak English, I have a business. At some point I did lobbying, both here in the state and in the capital, in DC. Nobody would ever think of me as undocumented.
Maru and other leaders in the Latino community say we can all do better, beginning with language, embracing accents of all types, and leaving assumptions behind.
I would dare anybody that is an adult watching this show to try to learn a second or third language and see how you get it. And yet, there's also an expectation that you have to speak perfect English, that you have to have a perfect accent, instead of recognizing how beautiful it is, each of our accents, because it reflects who we are, where we're coming from.
As for Jacqueline, instead of pursuing a dental practice, she's overcome her fear of driving and is empowering other immigrant women to do the same. She founded Mujer al Volante, which translates to Women at the Wheel, a nonprofit that helps others get their driver's license, giving them more freedom, self-confidence, and connection to community.
Many immigrants that face the racism, the discrimination, the stereotypes, they are, and I are, very resilient.
Many immigrants face more than negative stereotypes. These days, there's real concern about the health and well-being of immigrant communities. Sebastian Robertson has that story.
It's tradition.
Somewhere in Seattle, as the shadows get longer, you'll find Gloria Ramirez in the basement of an apartment complex.
This is for the ancestors. They come in today, so I want to say welcome to my people.
She's setting up for Dia de los Muertos. Marigolds for the fragility of life. Tamales, an offering for the dead. It's a long-standing cultural and religious holiday, a chance to remember and even connect with loved ones who have passed.
I don't want to worry about the virus because I know the virus is here. They need to stay happy.
They're gathering at a time when we're not supposed to, taking a risk that's even greater for this community because the pandemic is hitting the Hispanic population especially hard.
The other years, they have like a big celebration with my community. Today, it's not too much people.
A study compiled by the University of Washington and released in October of this year substantiates the claim that Hispanics are disproportionately affected by the virus. Take a look at the numbers. While Hispanics make up 13% of the population in Washington state, at one point, they represented 44% of the coronavirus cases.
There's a much higher risk of being positive if you're Latino.
Dr. Leo Morales is a medical doctor with the UW School of Medicine. He's also the co-director of the Latino Center for Health.
When I first asked about the data, I just wanted to see what was going on, and I was shocked by the difference.
Why the difference? Well, take Inslee's first Stay Home, Stay Healthy order issued in March. Do your part to stop the spread of the coronavirus. Work from home. That's great if you work in an office, but that's a luxury that many just don't have.
¿Qué dices a las personas que dicen, yo no soy Latino?
What do you say to people that say, I'm not Latino, this doesn't impact me, I ask Gloria.
There
is something extremely important that we need to recognize. Our community is made out of the essential workers that throughout the entire pandemic have been in the front line working.
It's not just the positive rates of infection that's affected the Hispanic community, but the death toll. In Washington state, Department of Health data shows Latinos are 4 times more likely than white people to die of COVID-19.
That number seems tremendous.
It is a number that I don't understand.
Now to the why. While there's no clear answer, experts point to possible explanations. Studies show that the longer a person is exposed to the virus may lead to a more severe case, a situation that could present itself in group housing or in close work environments. Lack of insurance may prevent people from seeking treatment until their case is severe. As for Gloria, she says many immigrants may be afraid to ask for help. And when it comes to the coronavirus, in many cases, that fear is amplified, something that's a reality for Gloria. The mom of 2 came to the U.S. from Mexico at 15 for an experimental treatment on her failing eyesight. She ended up staying illegally.
Antes del virus.
Before the virus, it may feel like you're living in the darkness, I told Gloria. And when the virus comes, what happens next?
El miedo es el doble porque si hablamos de ir a un hospital.
The fear is doubled. If we need to go to the hospital, we're scared. The bills, there's no work. How do we pay the bills?
A clear divide that Gloria points to between those who can and those who can't work from home.
It is impossible not to see the divide that exists.
Social inequality that's existed well before the coronavirus reached Western Washington, but one that the pandemic is now amplifying.
There's much truth to that. The social inequalities existed long before, and we cannot close our eyes to that harsh reality.
A reality that Gloria and others like her live with every day.
Actually, we're passing through a very difficult time, all of us around the world. And here specifically, we've always been separated.
Separated, but at the same time, Gloria explains, it's a troubled time that's bringing her community closer together than ever. Through masks, they return to traditions.
It sounds like you're more comfortable speaking up about this type of stuff today than before.
It took a long time.
Coming up, East African immigrants forced to stay silent in their home countries, now finding their voice in Washington in the Black Lives Matter movement.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jane Lee, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Work, and I study health disparities in immigrant communities.
As part of her work at the University of Washington, Dr. Jane Lee talks with Latino immigrants in New York City about these tense and divisive times.
My interest in this issue kind of emerged in 2016 when there was a lot of discussion about immigration, a lot of negative political rhetoric about immigrant communities. There was discussion about building a border wall, this depiction of immigrants as criminal, and just this negative discussion about the immigrant community.
What has your work told you about how the climate, socially and politically, is impacting immigrant communities?
It's shown me that there are psychosocial and emotional impacts on these communities, and that translates into behaviors, whether it's not going to access services or not going to the doctor because of fear about what might potentially happen, and that translates into negative health outcomes.
Recently, there's been a lot of talk of African Americans in particular facing a sort of double pandemic with COVID and systemic racism. Do you see the same thing with immigrant populations?
Definitely. So with the immigrant community, particularly the Latino community, we've seen disproportionate rates of COVID in that community, and that's in large part due to their roles as essential workers, living in multi-generational households. So not only are they exposed to coronavirus, but compound that with their barriers to accessing health services. There's a multiplicative effect or an exponential impact on their health.
Some of our viewers believe in some of the policies you're talking about. Why should they care about the impact of those policies on the immigrant community?
I think it's important to care about immigrant communities because our communities are so connected, and the health and well-being of immigrants will impact our own health. If we think about the different roles that immigrants face, they're a significant contributor to our economy. They're often frontline workers. They have jobs across different sectors, and when their health and well-being is jeopardized, our own health is placed in jeopardy as well.
What gaps in the system has your work exposed, and what are the remedies?
The major gaps are that a lot of the services that are offered aren't necessarily offered in ways that are culturally appropriate, aren't offered in ways that make sense for those communities. And so in order to address those gaps, we need to think about alternative and innovative ways to reach and access communities that might not necessarily have access to health services. And in order to do that, we need more funding, more support, and I think slowly but surely we are able to do that.
Are there programs in our state that are successfully addressing the gaps you described?
I think there's a lot of research going on, a lot of efforts, community-based efforts, partnerships with community organizations, which are so critical, that do know their communities and are trying to, create innovative programs, think about creative ways to reach their populations and communities to improve health outcomes. I can say that an important way to kind of mitigate some of those negative impacts on mental health is providing culturally appropriate information, resources for the community to address their mental health needs, and those resources and programs need to be delivered in ways that are acceptable for those communities, and they also need to be informed by the communities. So immigrants should have a say in how they want mental health services delivered to them or physical health services so that they can thrive, because truly immigrants and other communities are resilient and we have a lot of strengths. So really capitalizing on those strengths is important for improving mental health and physical health outcomes.
If you want to get involved, there are several community organizations you can partner with, including the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, El Centro de la Raza, and the King County Equity Now Coalition. Just text the word GUIDE to 206-448-4545, and we will send you a link to our resource guide. The state of Washington is home to more than 50,000 East African immigrants, many of whom escaped war and oppressive governments. We wanted to know what they think of the Black Lives Matter movement. They tell Ted Land, once in the U.S., they realized it wasn't always the content of their character that mattered.
Sharing my story makes this union better.
Awali Farah came to the United States from Somalia in 1984 as a refugee. Unlike most African Americans who grew up in the U.S., Farah says he did not even think much about the color of his skin until he moved here at the age of 19.
Did you experience or did you notice racism when you lived in Somalia? Did that happen?
No, honestly, no. I did not learn racism until I came to the United States.
He says he quickly learned some people only saw that he was black. a startling realization.
Was there a time when you came to the United States that you considered yourself an immigrant or East African? That's how you identified. And then did that change to I identify as a Black American?
That's a very good question. I identified myself as an East African. I didn't identify myself as Black. But I learned, being in the United States, it doesn't matter if I identify myself as an East African, so long as my skin is Black. I'm Black in the United States.
Your self-identity
it's given. It doesn't matter. What do you think of yourself?
At what point do you think you became aware of what racism is in America?
Working in the corporate world.
Farah says he brushed it off while working as an engineer at Boeing and AT&T. Maybe if he complained, he'd be seen as unappreciative of this new life.
You want to keep your head down, work hard, achieve the American dream, never make a wave. Just blend in, never be seen.
It's estimated more than 40,000 people in King County are immigrants and refugees who were born in East Africa. Many of them share stories like Awali's. Keep your head down, don't cause a stir, don't ruin this dream. But those attitudes are changing, driven in part by a momentous 2020.
My mom or grandma is not likely to be outside in the streets protesting, but I know I am.
Hamdi Mohammed is a community organizer whose family fled civil war in Somalia in 1993 when she was a toddler. That violence scarred her parents' generation. A different kind of turmoil is shaping hers.
When the death of George Floyd happened, I know my anxiety was high, so high that week. I was worried about my husband. I was worried about my nephews. I called and I checked on them. I told them about their rights. I told them how they should engage with police officers.
Mohammed says she and other younger Black immigrants are increasingly marching, protesting, advocating, and voting as they grow and gain a deeper understanding of the forces working against them.
As newcomers, people who are immigrating to this country or coming here as refugees, they're not given any sort of classes or information about what it means to be a Black person in the United States.
They kind of figure this out on their own.
Yeah, you figure it out on your own. There is a dark history in this country that has oppressed folks who look like myself. A lot of immigrants and refugees do not come with that sort of understanding, so it takes time understanding that and understanding what institutional racism is. I have had conversations with my older aunties, with our community members who might not even speak English very well and who are very newcomers to the United States and understand what is happening. They see the patterns, right? They're seeing unarmed Black men being killed over and over again, and they're able to make that connection to what is happening and understanding that there are institutions and systems built to work against Black and brown folks.
The rights I enjoy in the United States was done by the blood of African Americans who put their life on the line for me to enjoy this.
Awali Farah says it was only in recent years that he felt comfortable opening up about his experiences and participating in the mechanisms of change.
I will bring your voices to the City Hall.
Last year, he ran for Kent City Council, pushing for increased access to public transit and affordable housing.
We need to be visible, we need to speak, we need to be part of the solution to make this country better than it is today.
Immigrants like Farah and Mohammed came to the U.S. escaping war and governments that don't tolerate activism. As Americans, they say they feel a sense of duty to challenge the embedded historical racism here and the new reality of racism for them.
We are impacted by racial profiling. We are impacted by all of these different issues that our African American brothers and sisters have been fighting for decades.
We have so much to contribute. So for us not to say something is a disservice to the essence of being American.
After a quick break, our experts will answer your frequently awkward questions. Now it's time for Frequently Awkward Questions, the part of our show where our experts answer questions that you may be too afraid or too embarrassed to ask. This week's question from a viewer in Tequila. Is there a difference between race and ethnicity? The answer from King 5 race consultant Dr. Caprice Hollins.
Though many people use it interchangeably, so race has to do, of course, we know, with the social constructions. Africans and African Americans are of the Black race, but ethnically, we are of different cultures. So ethnicity has more to do with culture than it does with race. So we can share the same racial group, but a different culture.
If you have a question for our experts and you want to see it on an upcoming episode of Facing Race, text FAQ to 206-448-4545. Next week on Facing Race.
Hearing about countless Black and brown bodies being murdered, that has a visceral impact on our bodies and our psyche.
The toll racial injustice is taking on people of color, mentally and physically, plus the psychology of discrimination.
Our brain is this wonderful organ, but it's incredibly lazy.
We ask doctors, are we hardwired to be racist?
So if we choose to expose ourselves to racist information, then that will get reinforced in our brains.
We want to thank you for being here tonight and for sharing your stories. To watch this or any episode of our show, you can find it online at king5.com/facingrace. We do hope you'll join us again next week. And from all of us here at King 5, good night.